Welcome, everyone. I'm Professor Karen Tongson, the Chair of Gender and Sexuality Studies here at USC. And it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the sponsors of this event, the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies, the Center for Feminist Research, and of course, the Barbara Streisand Foundation, to today's event on 100 years after the 19th Amendment, the power of Black women in politics today. And the event today is really our occasion not only to mark women's suffrage and passage of women's suffrage in the United States, but also the different forms of the expansion of that vote to women and women of color, in particular following the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And we're going to be exploring today the slow and steady introduction of women of color into the US electorate that's driven the entrance of diverse officials as political representatives. So the panel today will be focusing on the importance of women's voting and its impact on the development of diverse leadership in US politics. And I'm really thrilled to have with us today Professor Nadia Brown from Purdue University and Assembly Member Sydney Kamlager. And before we get to the main event and the conversation, I want to let all of you know who are attending here to send any questions you have that may come up during the first portion of this discussion through the Zoom Q&A section of the webinar. There's a Zoom Q&A chat bar. Feel free to enter your questions there whenever they strike you. And the last portion of our hour together will be dedicated to audience questions. In the meantime, I'm going to hand it over now to my colleague, Professor Francile Roussan-Wilson, who is Associate Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity and History here at USC, as well as Gender and Sexuality Studies. She's an intellectual and labor historian whose current research examines the intersections between Black labor movements, Black social scientists, and Black women's history during the Jim Crow era. Her book, The Segregated Scholars, Black Social Scientists and the Creation of Black Labor Studies from 1890 to 1950, was awarded the Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Prize for the best book in African American women's history by the Association of Black Women's Historians. And, you know, Francile is also a curator of a recent exhibit here and does tremendous work throughout the university and nationally. And so I'm going to hand it over to my dear colleague, Professor Francile Roussan-Wilson.
Thank you so much, Professor Tongson. I really appreciate your generous introduction, and I'm really excited about today. We're going to spend about 25 minutes to a half an hour in conversation. I'm going to ask some questions after I introduce our two amazing speakers, and then our panelists will entertain questions from you, the audience. And so we're really excited about this afternoon. I'm very pleased to welcome back to USC, even if it's via Zoom, Assembly Member Sydney Kamlager, who represents the 54th Assembly District of California that encompasses a wide swath of the city of Los Angeles, from Baldwin Hills and the Crenshaw community, encompassing all of Culver City, Ladera Heights, Lamar Park, Mar Vista, and Mid-City Los Angeles, as well as Westwood. Sadly for me, as I looked up her district, it ends just 2 blocks from my Mid-Wilshire home, and I'm going to have to weigh in when those assembly districts are redone in the next couple of years and get back in that district. I used to be in, I don't know if it was called the 54th, but I used to, they moved the district line literally 2 blocks, and I'm in a different assembly district. The assembly member was born and raised in Chicago and moved here to attend USC, where she earned a master's degree in political science and joined Zeta Phi Beta sorority. She earned her master's degree in arts management and public policy from Carnegie Mellon. Kamlager Kamlager is chair of the Select Committee on Incarcerated Women and focused on reviewing and reforming policies to support the health, dignity, and rehabilitation of women in prison. In 2019, she guided 6 of her 8 bills to the governor's desk, all of which were signed into law. And I'm going to ask her some questions in just a minute about that. She also serves on the Penal Code Revision Committee that is studying and recommending ways to simplify and rationalize criminal law in California. She also sits on the Public Safety Committee. Assembly member lives in the View Park neighborhood. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
And I'd also like to give a hearty USC welcome to Professor Nadia Brown, who's the university faculty scholar and associate professor of political science and African American studies at Purdue University. She specializes in Black women's politics and also holds a graduate certificate in women and gender studies, in addition to her PhD from Rutgers University. Her research interests lie broadly in identity politics, legislative studies, and Black women's studies. While trained as a political scientist, her scholarship on intersectionality seeks to push beyond disciplinary constraints to think more holistically about the politics of identity. She is the author of, or editor of several award-winning books, including Sisters in the State House, Black Women and Legislative Decision-Making, Distinct Identities, Minority Women in U.S. Policies, The Politics of Protest, readings on Black Lives Matter, and several other books. She's the lead editor of Politics, Groups, and Identities, and is part of the Me Too Poli-Sci collective, where she spearheads efforts to stop sexual harassment in the discipline. In July of 2021, Dr. Brown will be a professor of government and director of women's and gender studies at Georgetown University. Currently, she lives outside of Los Angeles.
I wish.
Los Angeles, Indianapolis. I'm looking at Indianapolis and saying Los Angeles with her husband, 3 young daughters, her mother, and their dog, Ziggy. And I left out assembly members, the names of assembly members' cats. And I hope if she chooses, she can plug them in as well. I'm going to start with the assembly member and ask her what made her decide to run. Why did you decide to run for assembly, and how does your identity shape how you relate to your constituencies and how you want to advocate for policies?
Well, thank you for the question, and good to be here. Always good to represent USC as a fellow Trojan. Have to give that shout out. Yesterday, I gave greetings to UCLA for their Black Convocation, and I had to don a UCLA shirt. So I said, let me go back to my roots today. You know, I spent a number of years working with and for now Senator Holly Mitchell, another superstar in the California legislature who is also an African-American woman. And part of the work that we did together when I served with her on her staff was working to engage and empower and mentor other Black women to run for office. And so at some point, the bottle stops and it points at you, and you have to jump in and you have to run. And I find that as Black women, we certainly can lead from the front, but oftentimes we're leading from the back or from the side. And many folks say that that's where they feel most comfortable. And sometimes it's really not an option to continue to stay in that space. You have to push or get pulled further. And so one of the reasons why I decided to run, quite honestly, was because, A, she told me to, and B, I was not willing to yield that seat to someone else who was not a Black woman, because I have seen the compassion, the authenticity, the transparency, the honesty, and the brute force that comes from a Black woman in a seat of power legislating. And that kind of thought, that kind of decision making, those skill sets certainly benefit other African American women, but they also help everyone. I tend to believe that, the high tide rises all boats, and when we are lifted up, everyone else is lifted up with us. And so really I ran to protect that legacy and to extend it, to have another Black woman lending perspective, lending brute force, and lending an authenticity that is felt and understood by so many other folks that never are able to see themselves in that space. And so as the assembly member for the 54th, the first hat that I wear is as a constituent of my district. And I come always speaking to and about the things that I see in and around my district. But of course, an aspect of that is that of a Black daughter, a Black wife, and a Black woman. And my goal is never to sort of marginalize other folks, but to allow folks to see the intersectionality that happens and the commonality that is with all of us. But I try to lead with being a neighbor and a resident of the district, because those are the folks that voted for me and those are the folks that I represent.
Thank you so much. I want to ask Professor Brown to give us just a little bit of background on having written a book about Black women in state legislatures. I know as a historian that the very first Black woman, Crystal Byrd Fawcett of Philadelphia, was elected in 1938 to that state assembly, but we didn't get a Black woman in the US Congress until 1968, and when Shirley Chisholm was elected from Brooklyn. So can you give us a kind of an overview of Black women in elective office in the US, our experience? There seems to be a lag between when Black women get elected versus Black men, and yet at least I see that there are proportionately more Black women at least in the US Congress than white women, not in terms of numbers, but in terms of the proportions, their proportion in the legislative Black caucus. So can you tell us something about how Black women get elected, what the history of that is?
Sure. Thanks for the question. So first, big thank you to Professors Tongson and Wilson for inviting me here. And it's an honor to share space with Assemblywoman Kamlager, who actually represents my husband's family. They're in Leimert Park on Hepburn Avenue off of Crenshaw. So shout out to Aunt Norma, who's also a big fan of USC and lives there. So it is a tremendous honor to be here. So we are a USC adjacent family. And so Professor Wilson, right, is exactly right. Byrd Faust gets elected as a Republican in 1939 to from Philadelphia to the Pennsylvania state legislature. And as a Democrat, falls out of love, right, with party politics, and supports Dewey and decides she wants to become a Republican. And there's this big rift between her. She was actually a good friend of Eleanor Roosevelt at one point. And it's so illustrative that you ask about Byrd Faust, because this rift, this break between Black women and party politics, is really what undergirds your question, right? How do they get elected? How do they get here? It usually isn't from the support of party politics. So what my research shows is that Black women are fighting this uphill battle to get the resources of political parties, for political parties to support them in primaries and the places where they need that first backing, so that the resources to get their name out there, to win in the primary, and then to move on to the general election, that parties just aren't willing to do that. And fast forwarding to 1968, to the historic election of Shirley Chisholm, who also, right, goes toe-to-toe with her party in the same ways that Crystal Faust did, right, with the Democratic Party back in the 1930s. The reason why is because parties don't see Black women as electable, unfortunately. So all of my research, I'm an ethnographer, I talk to Black women, candidates, and elected officials, and I would say probably about 95% have horror stories of things that they had to go through with their own political party, either at the local level, the state level, at national level. It just keeps compounding. And that is one of the biggest gatekeepers and boundaries. But all mixed in through there is also sexism, it's racism, it's this idea that Black women need to wait their turn, that they are, as something women Kamlager said, that they should lead from the sides or from the back. And the women in my studies are saying they will make a way out of no way. So they use their own networks. They use these kind of indigenous groups of other Black women to fill in the gaps that the party should have been doing, or to put each other into power positions, right? Instead of waiting to be made the queen from the kingmaker, queenmaker inside of the Black politics party, right? With the Black politics wing. So not having someone come down from above and say, it's your turn now, please run. These women are taking it upon themselves and are doing it. So it really is this brute force. And I was so glad to hear these kind of comments, because I think this dovetails directly into my response, that it's not just this one experience that Assemblywomen Kamlager is sharing, but this is the breadth of my life's work. So I've been doing research on Black women elected officials since 2009, and I've heard the consistent story no matter where I go. Black women Republicans, Democrats in the South and the North, the Midwest are all sharing these similar stories.
That's fascinating. It's a little concerning, but fascinating. And I think perhaps some of the women that are running right now for Congress are really illustrative of what you're saying. You know, they're running from as outsiders in a lot of cases. I want to turn back to the Assembly member and ask her to tell us a little bit about these 6 bills. It seems that you have been extraordinarily effective in the Assembly. Do you think it was your time working for now Senator Holly Mitchell? And tell us about your successes and what you still want to accomplish in the Assembly.
Well, there's so much to do, especially, given this year and in a time of COVID. There are issues that around climate change, around sort of Black economics, poverty, our failing public health infrastructure, our continued spotlight on the criminal court system, how we level the playing field. Our education, our public education system, the huge disparities there. I just read something about the first Black girl being suspended on Zoom in school. So there are, pick an issue, that is where we need to be focused on. I actually want to add to what Ms. Brown mentioned. So in California, we've had 14 African-American women who've served in the legislature. The first Black woman was the Honorable Yvonne Braithwaite Burke, who was elected in 1966, but the first Black man was elected in 1918. And of course there was like 50 years before that when California didn't even want to have Black people in the state. So now, and I'm number 14. So it just goes to show you, in the time of say her name and Black women sort of holding up, all pillars of our society and economy, for us to be able to say we've only had 14 in as progressive a state as California is a little disconcerting. I will also sort of add to the horror stories that Ms. Brown sort of talked about. In 2016, myself and about 45 other Black women showed up in DC to have a conversation with the California Democratic Party post-election to talk about, you know, Stacey Abrams, Hillary Clinton, all of these things. And the party said, we have no African American female platform. We have no money to support infrastructure or programming that Black women have been doing to help you all do what you need to do to get out the vote. Because the polls have shown that Black women get out and vote consistently. And yet, as a party, we have nothing for you. And that was an eye-opening experience because it spoke to the fact as to why there are so many women on the outside, quote unquote, who are saying, I'm gonna do it my way and run, because we've been sort of, we've been sort of adopted by a party who still, even in 2016, couldn't figure out how to find some ways to support us, recognizing that they were so dependent on us. I was so successful, I think, with my bill package last year because I, like so many other Black women, we are good negotiators. We figure out how to make a way out of no way. And it's, the art of compromise, the art of being sort of dogged in your desire to help people understand the importance of a bill, your ability to sort of build coalitions, and ultimately your ability and your willingness and maybe the courage to just stand by yourself alone and talk about an issue and its pervasive impact on communities, specifically communities of color. And to shame or to dare people to suggest that what you're saying is not true. And you run the risk of getting shot down, you certainly do, but sometimes people listen to their quiet self and they say this is something worth supporting. And I think with my implicit bias bills last year and ultimately with my probation reform bill this year, that is what happened.
Well, thank you. And I have a follow-up on your implicit bias bill, which I'm going to ask you to describe, but I'm going to also ask you and I'm going to ask both of you about what you think about the current effort by the federal government to ban critical race theory, and it looks like they want to ban implicit bias and other kinds of bias training. And I know here at USC, we've gotten faculty has gotten a letter from our research division saying that they're trying to figure out what this new ban means for the university and how it's going to affect the kinds of training that's going on at the university. So I was really interested to see that you'd gotten an implicit bias bill passed. So if you could first tell us what that bill does, and then let us know how you feel about the federal ban on critical race theory.
It was there were two bills in a 3-bill package, one on law enforcement, one on the medical community, and one on judicial officers in the courts. Everyone comes to the table with bias. We come with prejudices all the time. So it's not about how do you sort of get rid of them, but it's certainly about how you sort of acknowledge that you have them and then work to kind of check them in hopes of mitigating. And also recognizing that every now and again, you need a refresher course on those biases that you have, because they pop up and metastasize just like anything else. Mostly because of the data that's out there that show that people of color, people in the LGBT community, women suffer from implicit bias when they're going to see their doctors or physicians. They are treated differently. It's assumed that we're able to take on more pain, that we don't need certain exams. And so one way to address this is by mandating implicit bias. And it happens patient to doctor, nurse to doctor, et cetera. The same with the courts. You go before a judge, you're dealing with a judge, you're dealing with a bailiff, you're dealing with a prosecutor, you're dealing with a public defender. They too all come with biases. And just like those in the medical community, this sector is also responsible for making decisions that can impact your life. And so isn't it important to make sure that on a periodic basis, we are requiring some sort of implicit bias training so that we do not see such disparities in our sentencing and how folks are charged, in denials, for appeals, et cetera. So the goal was to kind of put implicit bias on Front Street so that we can begin a more holistic and comprehensive and maybe self-reflective approach to eliminating some of the biases that are embedded in many of these systems that make decisions about how we live and about our degree of freedom. I am disturbed but not surprised by what is coming out of the federal government. And this is very similar, I think, to what we have on the ballot in California with Proposition 16 as a result of Proposition 209, which folks voted on over 20 years ago. And so I love what you said about trying to figure out a way around this now that it's coming down the pike, because that is also what universities had to do after Prop 209 was passed, to figure out a way around how we continue to want to minimize the fact that discriminatory practices and racism and bigotry and sexism exist and are alive and well in all aspects of our life.
Thank you. And Professor Brown, how do you feel about this federal ban on critical race theory being taught?
So it's an executive order, so it's really unenforceable unless Congress comes in and puts teeth behind this mandate that Trump is proposing. But it's very scary, right? When this came out 2 weeks ago, it was Constitution Day, and I was scheduled to give a talk at a small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania on the role of race and racism in the Constitution and its legacies today. And I was literally scared. I wasn't sure how others would perceive the talk because I was making these direct linkages to the framers' failure to directly address racism and the plight of enslaved folks and free Blacks as the linkages to today's Black Lives Matter movement. And I was very concerned about how my talk would be received and if it was going to be recorded and shared out, right, to others outside of the university, and what that might mean for my own academic career, safety of my family, right? All of these things, as we know that academics are being attacked now for some of the things that we do research on. So these are not our opinions. This is not, me sitting around and thinking, well, how can I say that the framers and the founders of the Constitution of our nation were racist, right? These are undisputable in some ways facts, right? That the framers held people of African descent in different esteem, unworthy of full citizenship, even if they were not enslaved. And by not addressing race and overt racism, they've allowed for, they set a path-dependent system in motion to continue on where Black humanity is denied and denounced, where Blacks can be killed in the streets with impunity, right? And have millions of people view them as a viral tweet or something on TikTok or on Facebook without putting any teeth behind this. So it's not just training people that racism exists, it's how do we do something about it? And this is what this training does. And as academics, I think that, especially as social scientists, it's our job to explore society and the multiple ways in which humans shape the institutions and structures that govern our lives. And racism is one of those structures that govern all Americans' lives, whether it's through white privilege, it's through homophobia, it's through xenophobia, right? There are all these, these biases that we bring, as the Assemblywoman said. It's not if you have them, it's right, what are they? And then how do you address them? And yeah, to be honest, right, I am fearful that this kind of research that we do will be under attack in some even more pronounced ways. And I think about the flip side of us being a country like France that doesn't take direct measurement on race. And then while they're dealing with their own Black Lives Matter crisis, right, where particularly North African migrants and second generation or third generation citizens are dealing with the same things that Black Americans are dealing with here. But the country has no data to explain or for social scientists like me to study the prevalence of this happening. I think this is the easy way to say that it's not a problem and it's not happening, or it is a one-off thing. And if we don't have social science data to back up that this is not just something that happened to Breonna Taylor, something that happened to George Floyd, that is a systemic problem in our nation, this and other things, right? Black maternal health, levels of mental health and substance abuse, right? If we don't have these kind of data, we are worse off for it as a society. And that falls on the burden of social scientists, right? People in the academy who can study these things. And if the government doesn't support us in doing this work or actively tries to crack down on it, I see it as a long road back to the dark ages.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to ask, just before we get to our questions, I want to ask the Assembly member who I know has been engaged with both the Women's March and Black Lives Matter movement. How do you think that Black women legislators at every level should be involved in the public politics of today? You know, should they march? How do you engage, and how would you suggest that others of your peers should engage with the current situation right now?
Well, so, you know, Black women are not monolithic, and we come to our Blackness in various ways. And some people lead with race, ethnicity, sexual orientation. You know, there are different ways in which we identify. So I certainly don't want to speak for everyone, but I know that I find myself very much involved in the public politics of today. I think it is important to march. It's important to show solidarity. It's also important to just be present so that you can hear and listen to what the streets are saying. And I have found that the streets don't always want you to respond, but they want you to just acknowledge their presence. And sometimes legislation can be reactive, and sometimes it's more about it just being sort of empathetic. But I certainly try to be present, because that's what informs my work. That's what informs how I decide to work on legislation. That's what has informed my desire to chair the Select Committee on Incarcerated Women. That was really to sort of use, because I have found that when we talk about the criminal court system, oftentimes when folks are talking about, you know, perpetrators and predators, the vision in your mind is generally a Black or brown man. And so that's usually the reference that you're using when you're thinking about what else should be added to the penal code. So my goal, quite frankly, was to flip the script on, you know, who the quote unquote alleged perpetrators are, and to show them as being women. And to hope that that would bring about a little more compassion and empathy with regards to how we're deciding what else to add to the penal code, if anything. And then really to use that as a Trojan horse to then have us rethink how we actually see and frame our men of color as well. But I think it's very important to be engaged in the streets and in the movement.
Thank you. And one of the questions that we have from our audience for both of you is, will and how much will attitudes change if Kamala Harris is elected to be Vice President of the United States? Do you think attitudes will change about Black women run electability, or will attitudes change about Black women in general, which really I think we all agree needs a major attitude shift? And I would add to that question, do we want to put that whole burden on the person running for vice president? Is that, if attitudes don't change, is that going to be her fault? But how important is it that she's running for, that we have a Black woman running, Black and South Asian woman running for vice president?
I think symbols matter. So for people to look up and see that there is a multi-ethnic Black woman as the VP matters a lot. It says to young children, it says to other women that are thinking about running for office, multi-ethnic women, Black women, that they can do this too. But also, Kamala Harris has signaled that she wants to take this role on, right? So in the acceptance speech, right, she talks about her roots at Howard University, her membership in Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, right? So she's really drawing heavily on, right, her Afro side, and she's also talking about her mother as a South Indian woman and an immigrant in her family, right? So she is recognizing that these symbols matter deeply, that she is a representative of her parents, and this is something that is unique and different for American politics. On the other hand, right, I want to give the half glass full and the half, it is what it is glass, is that she runs on her record, right? She brings with her who she is. And when you run at this level of national politics, she's just not a hypothetical multi-ethnic Black woman. She is someone who Americans have gotten to know over the course of the last 4 years, particularly at her term as a senator nationally and running for president. And she has tied her fate, right, to Joe Biden and a particular brand of the Democratic Party. So when people are thinking about her, they're also, couching her within her own particulars. And I think that's really important, because one, it shows that Americans aren't thinking about a hypothetical Black woman that anyone will stand in, that they're really understanding her as an individual and assessing her as such. And my own research says that highly engaged voters, and particularly Black women voters, know who they're voting for, right? And they know the policies, they know the issues, and they're not just casting their vote because it's the in vogue thing to do. And particularly voters that are coming from majority minority districts really have a good understanding of who they're voting for. They're not relying on race or gender as a cue to say, I should vote for you because you look like me. I think you'll do what I want you to do when you're in office. But they actually look up who this person is, right? They get all the information to decide to vote for her. So, so it's the symbolic politics that really matters. And on the other hand, it's people know who she is and they are assessing her based on who she is. So I don't want to paint her as much of a unicorn, although she will be, right, as the third Black woman to run for president. Right, she is a unicorn in some ways, but she's also a real life person who has a record and policies to fall back on.
Thank you. And I'm going to follow that up with also for both of you, but if you could start us off, Professor Brown. One of the questions is, what is the significance of Cori Bush's primary win for Black women's politics? And before you start, I'm going to just say that Cori Bush ran in, the district she ran in was the district my mother lived in and that I grew up in. And so I was able to see that district just been very gerrymandered, so there wouldn't be a Black person elected, and then, you know, became changed and sort of became a legacy district for the Clay family. So what do you think that significance is? And there have been other Black women that have run insurgent political campaigns as well.
Yeah, so this is a really exciting race. As a political scientist, I am super excited about Cori Bush. One, right, because she represents this progressive branch of the Democratic Party. And she did this, like you shared, right, on the outskirts, fundraising without having the backing and support of the Democratic Party, and literally running against this legacy seat, right, that was held by the Clay family. The voters were wholly disenchanted by Clay's lack of engagement with the district. So I was in Ferguson in 2014, participated in the Black Lives Matter movement. That's where I got to first meet Cori Bush and then later interview her when she ran the first time against Clay. And I've just been awestruck of her tenacity and her zeal and her quest to represent the people, because the first thing that she said to me was, I was out on these streets and I was hopeful that Clay would show up, right, on the first day, on the second day. And she started listening to the voices of the people, right, the students, the young people, the residents who were so, you know, just overwhelmed with grief, with fear, so many emotions. And she said, well, where's our elected officials? They should be here to do this. And she stood in the gap, someone who wasn't elected. And I think that kind of passion for your community comes through, and that's what voters responded to. So I'm so interested to see how she will work with the Democratic Party towards governing. I'm interested to see what this new coalition of younger Black progressives will do to the political party, but particularly what they'll look like in the Congressional Black Caucus. So the Congressional Black Caucus is an older, more moderate branch, pragmatic group of elected officials who, again, like have a singular focus of advancing Black issues. And I think all of the, right, Bush and the others that come in will also do that, you know, have the same single-minded focus. I think they'll just have different tactics. So I'm interested to see how this will play out. I'm honestly excited, and I'm hoping to do some more pointed research on her.
Assembly member, and then I think Karen Thompson wanted to weigh in as well. No? Okay, Assembly member.
Well, you know, I too was watching that race. She was highlighted in a film not long ago about young women sort of taking it upon themselves to run, to represent the people. You know, many of us do not represent majority Black districts. And so we are enlisting the faith of folks who don't look like us to believe in us and to believe that we will represent everyone in a way that is fair and meaningful. And I have not met Cori, but I have watched her and have rooted for her. And I believe that she's also going to come into this position with that focus. But I think it's also, you know, an important opportunity for even for the Black community to recognize once again that we are not, you know, monolithic, that we come with different experiences and needs. And oftentimes we spend a lot of time and energy focusing on social issues and not as much focusing on the economic issues, which are often the undercurrent, you know, to so many of the consequences that we face. And so my hope is that with this new movement that we are able to find some time to talk about Black economics, about the economics of poverty in a way that can resonate with everyone. Because until we begin to sort of be incisively aggressive about how our systems are structured in a way to bind us to poverty, then we will be cycling through young people who are optimistic and excited about representing us, and then they will get into the system and then they will say, are you kidding me? This is not what I bargained for. I can do much better and much more for my people on the outside. And I don't want that to happen, because there's actually so much good that can come from coalitions within government working to create change.
I want to just add, I think you've made an important point, and I don't think that actually Cori Bush's, as well as yours, or certainly Barbara Lee in the Bay Area, I don't think their districts are majority minority districts. I know that district, Cori Bush's district, very well, and while it's gotten blacker in some ways, in interesting ways, gentrification has also happened. So the neighborhood that my parents had to fight bond issues to literally allow Black people to build homes that are now called mid-century modern homes, but then they were just ranch houses. That neighborhood of houses has been fully gentrified, and it's no longer, I mean, they're the same houses, but they're no longer owned by Black people. And so, you know, the demographics of the district that she's in are quite interesting. And I found that the breakdown of the vote was also very interesting, that, you know, whites tended to vote a little bit more for Clay, Lacy Clay, and but I think Black people were really turned off, quite frankly, by him. He was not his father, who, you know, was had a long relationship with labor and other things, and so I think that we probably don't give enough credit, and I'm glad you brought this up, about the Black people elected both at the state level and the federal level who don't represent majority minority districts. There's quite a number of them.
Yeah,
So,
there's a difference between, I think, being demographically Black and being vocally Black. Sometimes the communities, you know, vocally are Black, but if you look at the data, that's not the majority of the voters.
Exactly. Well, one of our questions, the next to the last question, is, although I mentioned one that you were a sorority member, Assemblywoman Kamlager, the questioner assumes that Professor Brown also is a sorority member. I don't know that if that's true. I don't know if they saw something in your background.
I'm a Delta. Yeah, all of usually.
Yeah, all of the red and white. Yeah, I'm not a member of a sorority, but I come from a family of Deltas. So the question is whether fraternities and sororities are mobilizing. How important is that, and how important are other Black professional and, you know, social groups organizing for this and other elections?
I would say yes. I think oftentimes fraternities and sororities try to stay out of politics because folks are concerned about their 501c3 exemption status, and so figuring out how to do educational outreach without ringing any bells is important. But you know, Kamala Harris ignited, you know, the pink and green brigade when she decided to run for presidency, and in turn, I think galvanized all of the Divine Nine, the other fraternities and sororities, to say, yes, we love this, because, you know, I think all of the fraternities and sororities sort of talk about scholarship and service and giving back. So I know with my organization, I've been doing some candidate forums, and we've been getting out the word, and people have been involved in phone banking, because it's incredibly important to the legacy of her sorority, to the legacy of the movement that and the legacy of Black fraternities and sororities in general, and to really sort of talking about the importance of Black education.
And I'll add two things. So Delta had created a new 501c4 organization that allows members to give towards political and social change, which is what the organization was founded on. But Black sororities and fraternities are crucial spaces for Black women's networks and training people in civic skills. And so in my own research, I find that there are women who didn't know that they were being drafted to run for office, but they were just helping out a big sister, or they were, helping someone out who was a chapter member or some sort, and then realized they got involved in the issues and they themselves needed to run. And what they got out of the process was not just learning how the political system works, but learning how to work in a team. How do you use grassroots organizations to get things done? And not saying that a sorority or fraternity is a grassroots organization in that same kind of way, but learning very practical skills like phone baking, showing up to stuff envelopes at someone's kitchen table, watching someone's child while they are on the phone making calls to donors, right? These are the things that the women that I've talked to have done and did those for their sorority sisters. In my forthcoming book, I have a focus group with with members of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, where we talk about politics, and they forcefully say, I got involved in a sorority to be around like-minded people, but that also political socialization was part of this. So they know that in their network, if they don't vote, they are seen as kind of ostracized, right? This is what we do, right? These are things that is a norm in our society, in our group. And so they have to know the issues, right? They want to be a part of this community, and that's a norm. That's a social norm of people who are politically engaged. So it's not just giving money, but it's volunteering, and it's part of the structure that builds these civic awareness skills.
Thanks. I want to shift slightly from the running for office to ask both of you how you feel about the current attempt to the nomination of a woman as the Supreme Court to the Supreme Court following the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and how you think the Supreme Court affects American women, and will having a person that's a conservative and has had very clear views about a number of women's issues, how that might change life for women in general.
Nadia, do you want to?
Yes. So I'm a little, I'm disheartened by an idea that replacing Bader Ginsburg with another woman will be like a one-to-one replacement, just like a replacement of Thurgood Marshall to Clarence Thomas is not a one-to-one replacement. You don't have to be a woman to be a feminist, and all women are not feminists. So whoever takes this seat right now, Judge Amy Coney Barrett is the nominee that Trump would like to hold the seat, doesn't hold any of the views that Bader Ginsburg has espoused. So yeah, I just want to caution about that. The other thing I want to do is to remind folks that Bader Ginsburg learned her tools of using the 14th Amendment to push for gender equality from a Black woman, Pauli Murray, right? A Black queer, non-gender conforming woman, Pauli Murray. And she worked with her on understanding the due process clause as being someplace where women or they can kind of push for more gender inclusivity. And then Bader Ginsburg followed up on this tactic that she learned by watching Justice Thurgood Marshall, right, when he was the leader of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and meticulously building cases that he would argue to the Supreme Court that would incrementally push this notion around racial equality. And she did the same thing with gender equality. So again, I just wanted to maybe take us a little bit off track there to highlight the role of Pauli Murray, someone that we don't talk about. And if we are holding up Ruth Bader Ginsburg, we also need to hold up where she learned a lot of her skill from, which was Pauli Murray and Thurgood Marshall.
Thank you so much about, I didn't actually know that myself about Pauli Murray. I do know about her. And yesterday I was explaining to my Black Social Movements class that Pauli Murray coined the term Jane Crow and was just such a brilliant legal scholar, but also clearly experienced racial and gender discrimination at a very high level, and was, as we're learning, most likely non-binary, and was also one of the first in the first group of women Episcopal priests, and now she's a saint. So she's pretty amazing, saint, doctor. She had a PhD in law from Yale. Dr. Saint Pauli Murray, Esquire, so we can't really talk enough about her. People don't really know anything. Most people don't know anything about her, and she was quite important. And I think apparently a lot of fun. She's not somebody I ever met, but was a humorous person as well.
Well, I just want to say, for anyone out there who's feeling disenchanted or apathetic about this election cycle, the fact that this current person who's in the White House has been able to appoint over 200 lifetime federal judges should get you to the polls quicker than I don't know what. These are folks that will have lifetime appointments on the bench, and they are responsible for making decisions that impact our civil liberties and our rights. And so that should be a reason why people get out and vote this November. The Supreme Court is at the top of the list of concern, but there are a number of vacancies, and he has made it a point to fill as many of them as quickly as possible, with folks who are incredibly conservative and prescriptive and uninterested in many of the things that we've talked about during this hour.
Well, I want to thank everybody and turn things back over to my colleague Karen Thompson, who's got a brief conversation, a brief point she wants to make, and who will wrap things up for us. But thank you so much. This has been really a stimulating hour.
Yes, thank you both so much for being here. And I guess it's sort of my last comment or question is really springing off of the Assembly members' last remarks, especially about turning out to vote. And because the event, the subtitle of the event was about the the power of Black women in politics. So much is made of the reliability and stability of the Black female vote, especially for the Democratic Party. And I wanted to ask about whether or not you have any particular insight in how that might be affected this cycle, especially in light of the kind of disproportionate effects and impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on Black and Brown communities, and also with the intensified gerrymandering and voter suppression, and especially the kind of amplification around of rhetorics of violence around quote unquote poll watching, and whether whether or not this is just something that that will continue as it has in many years and decades past when Black women were intimidated, they still showed up and voted. I've just wondered, whether you had any insight or any knowledge, or from your own kind of encounter with polling data, or just in terms of like what the kind of word is in your various communities about the feeling going out there to vote this cycle?
I'm actually concerned about all the things that you raised, Professor Thompson, particularly these voter suppression and intimidation tactics, but particularly what this means for for Black women candidates going forward. If Black women if they don't turn out for a myriad of reasons, right? COVID, voter suppression, intimidation, I think it'll be a long time before the Democratic Party will say, let's put another Black woman on the ticket in this high profile way. I think that unfortunately Kamala Harris will be blamed for not turning people out without looking at the structures in which people had difficulty turning out. But on the upside, right, people in my network, women that I talk to do my research, are really pushing, have a plan to vote. So it's not just voting, but how are you going to do it? And making sure that you're talking with members in your own circle of influence where you can say, have you thought about what will happen if you see someone at the polls who is trying to intimidate you? You need to call the FBI. Or this is the deadline you have to register to vote, and this is what you need to do to get a mail-in ballot. Today we drove my mom, who is 65, so she got a mail-in ballot, and we drove it to the county elections office because we just weren't trying to play any games with the Postal Service, right? And I was so heartened to see the number of senior citizens out who are also doing the same thing. We're early voting in their masks for COVID because they were also trying to fight the crowds. So what we're seeing is that people are aware and they're trying to exercise their right to vote. I think it'll be reminiscent to what we saw in the Georgia primaries, where unfortunately, right, the Secretary of State had closed down a lot of polling places. There was problems with getting machinery, poll workers, but people stood in line for hours, right, in the hot sun and the pouring rain. That is an impediment to voting, but I think that people will do it because they understand just how important this election is.
I agree. Everyone should make a plan to vote. We've seen just recently, I think in North Carolina, they said that Black ballots were 4 times as likely to be rejected because the information on how to vote was new. You had to have a witness sign your ballot, which was new for that state. But it also showed that many folks were voting early. So they had an opportunity because they were getting called to make those corrections. The folks that I've talked to are incredibly motivated. I think seeing the part of the debate that you could stomach, but at least hearing the person say, stand down, but stand by, let everyone know that our lives are on the ballot. And so many of the folks that I've talked to are motivated in making sure that they are voting and that their friends and their family members are voting. And I also want to say, we have seen this before. It's looking different because of 2020, but we have seen violence as it relates to being Black before. If it's the lynchings of Reuben Stacy, it's the lynchings of Emmett Till. We have seen it when we've talked about, voter suppression and poll taxes and literacy taxes and tests and all of that. So none of this is new. And Black people and Black women, we know about sort of the Underground Railroad and the current manifestations of that as it relates to us getting out to vote. We've dealt with suppression before. We've dealt with intimidation before. But I don't know of too many Black folks or too many Black women who don't understand that their lives and the lives of their family members are on the line come November. And so everyone that I've been talking to has been figuring out how to make sure that their loved ones, have a plan for voting come November.
Thank you so much. And before we say goodbye, I also wanted to say, in terms of making voting plans, the USC Galen Center will be open as a voting center. Our gender studies colleague, Julie Russo, who is a leader in the USC Athletics BLM group and other USC organizations have put together USC Galen Center as a voting center. So please know that if you're in our local community, please show up, and I believe early voting will be available there. I want to thank all of you for attending and thank our remarkable guests, Assembly Member Sydney Kamlager, Professor Nadia Brown, and of course, our own Francine Roussan Wilson, who is receiving the noirish shadows of her blinds right now, you see, looking like really wonderfully. And I want to direct you all in the chat window, just if you want any more information about the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies here at USC, there's a link. You can check us out and stay in touch with us about our events. Also, USC Center for Feminist Research, which was really spearheaded this event for us. Thank you to Caitlin Dobson in particular for her assistance on this event. And certainly last but not least, the support of the Streisand Foundation. Thank you all, and please go out there and vote.